Let's do a little bit of setting here for a moment, Mike. Let's pretend that you're currently deep in a missile silo in North Dakota and you're tired of that position. You no longer want to work every day down in that deep hole of the silo. And you have a dream, and your dream is to be a professional, full-time powerlifting coach. And you come out of that bunker and you are now in the interview to work for a premier coaching company in the world. How do you sell yourself to me? Why should I hire Mike Tuchscherer?
I mean, the answer these days would be that I think I have a good understanding of the coaching process, and I would talk about leadership, relationship, creativity. I would talk about radically individualized training processes and systematizing training and coach-athlete relationships and things like that. Where I was in 2008 would have been some of that. I think the auto-regulation piece, the individualization piece has been a thread that's been consistent through my coaching career. But thinking back to the way systems were then and my understanding of the training process then, it's improved a lot, I think you would say, over these last 15 years.
It certainly has. And I'm definitely curious on systems. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But first of all, the good news is you're hired.
Lucky for me.
Lucky for you, you're hired. But now I want to take a step back from my role. I want to make you the CEO of the company. So with that in mind, what is the first thing that you're going to do to elevate the level of the coaching for this company and the sport of powerlifting?
I think the thing that has improved in coaching over the last 15 years has been an emphasis on athlete-centered coaching has been a huge improvement. But even down to the level of training tactics, I think we've seen how training specifically for drug-free powerlifters, it does need to be a bit different. Athletes respond a bit differently, and that has evolved and changed over the years. And we've developed systems and just ways of organizing training and technique. It's different in subtle ways, but they're important ways when you're the athlete who's experiencing the business end of the coaching.
Fantastic. And that really segues nicely into the question that Coach Kenny wanted to ask you. Coach Kenny recognizes, as a lot of people do, that you've brought a lot of different systems to the sport of powerlifting, not just RTS, but as a whole to the community. So which system have you done that's personally impacted you and why?
Which system have I learned
which system
from?
have you created that has most impacted you and why?
It would be hard to look past RPE, I think, as a system. So just quick backstory for anybody who maybe hasn't caught it. RPE was a system of regulating training effort. Originally comes from endurance sports. I read about RPE as applied to endurance training, would have been 2006 or something like that, and came up with the initial applications of applying it to resistance training, which to my knowledge hadn't been done in exactly that way. Maybe somebody had done more traditional RPE, right? A 10 is a heavy effort, a 9 is a moderately heavy effort, which is very vague and hard to apply, right? We applied a more intuitive rubric, I would say, where 10 is the RIR type of model, at least on the high RPE end of the scale, where 10 is a maximum effort, 9 is 1 rep in the tank, and so on down the line. That was the piece that I brought into powerlifting training initially in 2006 and to the broader powerlifting world in 2008 or so. It would be hard to overlook that in terms of systems and its impact on powerlifting and its impact on my life, which is totally unexpected, by the way. I did not expect it to catch on. I wasn't even thinking like that, right? I was a powerlifter who was getting into coaching. I'd coached my university team, and now here's this guy that wants me to coach him online. In 2008, at least in powerlifting, was just the beginning of all this online coaching stuff, right? my interest was in improving my own training, improving the training for the people I was working with. I didn't think about like, how's this going to impact the broader powerlifting world? That's just, it seems like a not productive way to think about things in general from a coach's perspective, but it's definitely changed my life.
I can imagine it definitely would have been difficult to imagine the influence that RPE would have had on the sport and where it's come from, being mostly just a tool that you use to now a tool that is used very broadly throughout the entire community of the sport, not just in the United States, but on a global scale. What does that mean to you? That this tool here that you brought over from a different sport and found a different way to apply it into the sport of powerlifting, what does that mean to you that it's reached such a broad scale and such a global scale in the sport?
It's kind of hard to wrap my head around sometimes. And I mean, I don't want to make it seem like it's about me, because sometimes what I think about is like, if it hadn't been me, what would have happened? You know, surely somebody would have come up with this. Somebody would have devised the scale. Like, surely it wouldn't have just been, it's not an idea that would have just evaporated into the ether. Surely, right? I'm grateful that I was in a position to see something that hadn't been done to that point and to be the one to do it. And I'm grateful that it's an idea that seems to be beneficial. I mean, it's been beneficial to me and to the lifters I coach. I think on balance, it's been a positive impact. It wasn't guaranteed to be a positive impact when it first came about, you know? I mean, you see a trend and you think, like, yeah, that looks like a good thing and let's keep pursuing that. But you know, I'm grateful, I guess, is the main emotion that I would feel at that point, right?
When was that moment, or even what was that moment like for you after bringing RPE to the broader community, that you realized it was going way beyond your expectations and you started to see it really catch steam and build momentum through different areas and different coaches beyond just your training and your programming?
I'm not sure when I really realized it. And I think it broadly happened without me realizing it. It just kind of did, you know, when I was answering questions on a forum and coaching lifters and, you know, just trying to do what I could do. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly when I noticed it. If I started online coaching in 2008, it would have been sometime before 2014 that it occurred to me, but I don't know when exactly. It just, I think the main thing that is good for me to do is to kind of keep my head down and keep working. And if it makes an impact, then that's fantastic. That's what I want it to do. And it's good to stop and smell the roses now and then. But for the most part, just keeping focused on what's the next thing is a good headspace to be in.
That really folds well into one of the questions that Coach Gabby wanted to ask. And she brought to the table and was curious, how do you maintain your curiosity after all these years, and the curiosity in training that led you to find the voice of powerlifting with RTS?
Radical self-delusion. I mean, a lot of it stems from a desire to continue solving problems, and it is to continue making progress, whether that's progress in my own training or progress for the athletes that I coach, trying to solve the problem. You know, that an athlete is struggling to handle the workload that you feel is going to be beneficial, or they can't do pin squats because of some sort of pain issue, or they're struggling with new bench depth rules or something like that. You have to solve these problems, and the ways that you solve them are important. Maybe a better example for kind of how I got to where I'm at now, I've had lifters get injured before, like lots of coaches have. And I remember one injury in particular was pretty formative for me. Had a lifter get injured, and when this happens, especially like the more severe kinds of injuries, I always ask myself, like, what could I have done to prevent this or to mitigate it or something, you know? And sometimes there's something to be learned there, and sometimes not as much, but it's always worth asking the question and pulling at the thread. And don't let yourself off the hook too easily either. You know, it doesn't have to be like this heavy burden that you internalize, right? But I had a lifter that got injured, and I was asking myself, like, what could I have done? And it didn't seem like anything at first, but you just kind of keep poking around, keep looking for something. And I think, well, it may not have prevented it, but what if I had done a little bit better job on load management? Or what if I had done a little bit better job on understanding how the stresses of these exercises were hitting different tissues and things like that? And well, okay, how do I incorporate that into my systems? How do I make sure that this doesn't happen to other athletes? But not just that, how do I make sure that it doesn't happen for other athletes even when I'm tired, even when I'm distracted, even when I'm, have other things pulling at my attention as a coach? So building it into those systems, I think, is critically important. And I guess that's the core question was about maintaining curiosity. And I guess that's it, is caring about the problem that I'm trying to solve.
You mentioned systems again, and Coach Kenny had a second part to his question about systems, if you're willing to share, of course. What's the next system that you're hoping to make or improve on?
Well, as you guys know, my fellow RTS coaches know, that I've been working on a dynamic load management system for a long time, and it gets better and better. It's still in kind of, I would say, an experimental stage, but we do use it with a handful of athletes and things like that. So it's kind of a dynamic load management system. It's an attempt to answer the question of, like, what would you do if you did as good of a job as you could possibly do from a load management standpoint? And just to maybe give a better example of what that might be like, we often have things pop up in a lifter's life, right? Something that causes you to move a training session, or maybe cut a training session a little bit short. And oftentimes coaches will get asked, like, well, what should I do to compensate for this? I've got to train 4 days in a row this week. Well, maybe that's not ideal. So lots of times coaches will just kind of eyeball it and, give a good enough solution. And I totally understand that. And that is a fine approach most of the time. But I thought, what would you do if you had nothing better to do than just one athlete, and you took that as, you were as detailed about that as possible? Like, what would you do? And started pulling at that thread a little bit and building a system around it. What would you do if you had an athlete who wasn't recovering as well? How would you tell that they weren't recovering as well as what you expected? And what sorts of adjustments would you make? What thresholds would you put in place for making those adjustments? And just kind of pulling at that thread. So I've been trying to build this system around it. We're still building it, but at some point we'll be able to roll it out to more athletes and hopefully make it more and more usable.
What about the greater sport in general? Like, you've been involved in the sport for, over 15 years now at this point. And we've seen massive changes and growth in the sport, particularly since the insurgence of raw lifting. For you, from your perspective, what about the sport has changed and evolved the most?
Yeah, I think the rise of raw lifting has been probably the biggest change, and growth in general, if that could be categorized as such. But when I started competing in powerlifting in 2003, it was all equipped. It was, much smaller. You would go to even major competitions were, not more than a couple days. The idea of having a 5 platform meet that lasts for a week, it was just not even in our consciousness at that point. So yeah, the rise of raw lifting, really the rise of drug-free raw lifting, I would say has been, I guess, maybe puts a finer point on it, and just the increase in popularity in general. It has to be the biggest change, but that comes with like a litany of smaller scale changes. Obviously the advent of online coaching changed my life in a pretty dramatic and unexpected way. But training in general has evolved and gotten a lot better, a lot more precise, a lot more thought through.
One of the questions that Coach John was curious about, and I'm going to add a little bit of a preface because we've touched on RPE and the impact of RPE on the sport.
Sure.
From that context already. So let's think about this without RPE in context. What surprises you the most about the impact that you and RTS has had on the sport of powerlifting?
I'm not sure. I've been thinking about this, and that's a difficult question to answer because I didn't expect really to have any impact. I expected to say what I thought was true and to do, good things for my athletes and for my own training. And that was about all I expected. I didn't expect to make a coaching company at all. The RTS as a company started with a book that I wrote in 2008 that was basically a collection of lessons learned from coaching my university team. And I thought it would stop there. I was hoping, my expectation was that, maybe I could sell enough copies of this book to finance my travel as I go to powerlifting competitions. I didn't expect to quit my job and start coaching online full time. I didn't expect to be able to hire other coaches. I didn't expect to, speaking of a blown expectation when it comes to hiring, we say now every time we do a round of hiring for coaches, I think if I was 23-year-old me applying for this job, I'm not sure I would get the job. Like the quality of candidates that we pull when we put out a letter for hiring, it blows me away. And not to deter anyone, from any potential future application or anything, but it's really amazing. So, blown expectations, yeah, all around, I never thought that I would be in this seat.
That definitely speaks volumes to the quality of the candidates we get, because I would have to say the same thing a lot of times, that I don't feel like my resume would make it through that initial round of applications when you took me on in 2017. So it's definitely really cool to see that evolution within the company from the inside. When we think about online powerlifting coaching, like that's definitely an impact that I think RTS has created. At least to my perspective, I don't know of really any online powerlifting coaching companies pre-RTS. Are you aware of other coaches that trained or coached primarily online before what you started doing? And I can't help but think that is also a way that RTS has kind of helped impact and drive the sport, has been the ability to provide quality powerlifting training from a remote setting.
I'm not aware of anyone doing primarily online coaching for powerlifting prior to 2008. And I'm not willing to say even that I'm the first. I think there were some people doing it in bodybuilding, but I was not aware of them. I wasn't aware of how they were operating their business models or anything like that. That again came as exercise and problem solving, So as the story goes, I had written this book and somebody emailed me and said, "Hey, will you coach me online?" And I literally didn't know that was a thing, but here's somebody who's like, "Hey, I'll pay you to do this." And I wanted to be coaching anyway, and that now wasn't part of my university setting anymore. So yeah, of course, I'll figure this out, So, well, how are they going to pay me? What are the terms going to be? How would you create and deliver the training? How do you manage the billing? How do you, all of those systems had to be created, and just figure it out as we go. I didn't really know anybody around to copy systems from, which, to be fair, would have been much more efficient than what I did. But, it got us to where we're at now.
For sure. Which also plays into some of the stuff that Coach Mark brought. And Mark's been with RTS since the very early stages. Yeah. He's your longest standing coach.
So if RTS started in 2008, Mark started with RTS in 2009, first as an athlete.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Mark is definitely a wealth of knowledge with his time with RTS and all the years of lifting prior to RTS.
Definitely.
And it's pretty fitting to hear Mark ask this question, in my opinion, knowing Mark. But he wants to know, knowing what you know now, what is the one big thing you would change if you could go back 15 years and start from scratch?
It would be hard to distill that to a one big thing, I think. But there's so much that you have to learn to operate a business. It shares a lot with coaching and powerlifting and any other skill that you acquire, right? That's a skill unto itself. I guess I would put some more effort around learning the business side of it and understanding. I understood some things, right? Like I understood how to read the basics of my financials and stuff like that, but I didn't know how to extract the bigger lessons from it. I didn't, understand, or maybe take seriously isn't quite the right thing that I mean, but I didn't understand quite how to extract the meaning from some of these things, how to say, oh, this project isn't really working, or it needs to be tweaked in this way, or it's fine to make this change, but that's a big risk to take. There's some things like that would have been good to know earlier. But you get by, I guess, or we did at least.
Definitely. We at RTS know that we write a lot of programming based on stress index, where a lot of other companies use different training metrics to track volume, intensity, relative intensity, different things of that nature. Coach Peter is curious to learn from you, like what started the concepts and formulations of stress index?
Stress index specifically started, again, it's an effort to solve a problem, right? We have this problem of needing to quantify the amount of work, and anytime you read something and it's talking about volume in kind of this broad conceptual sense, it's a quantity of how much work. But when you try to just distill that to tonnage, you run into problems. And that's just kind of a natural step to take. So lifters have tried to address that in general many times, like, well, what if we only count the number of barbell lifts or the number of barbell lifts over 50%? Or then there was a training formula that, was kind of tossed around for a while called INUL, which attempted to address some of this, but really didn't. There were some conceptual problems with it. But it's been this issue, right, that coaches have run into, where you have an issue of how do you quantify how much work it is that you're doing. And then the idea of counting your number of sets, number of working sets comes along. And that does seem to be a good way to get at the root of the issue. The only trouble is if you only count hard sets, well, what counts as a hard set? What counts as an easy set? Then hard sets count as 1, but easy sets count as 0? That doesn't seem quite right, So stress index started from that standpoint. Like, well, what if we try to be a little bit more granular than that? Like, what if easy sets count as something, and then you can use RPE to help you along with that, right? So higher RPE sets count as more work than lower RPE sets, and so on. And it kind of grew in complexity, again, from trying to solve problems. Like, well, this system works great in these contexts, but it doesn't in these other contexts. So you fiddle with the formulas a little bit and build the systems until it solves the problem in a better way.
To close things out today, Mike, one of the things that I was curious about, and I think a lot of coaches can relate to these moments, but I'm curious to know, what is your proudest moment as a coach?
As a coach, again, it's hard to think of one thing. I think of the relationships that I've built with athletes, and it's easy for like memories to come back to me of coaching at the Arnold and like standing on big stages. And those are profound moments for sure. But I remember the athlete that I was coaching. I remember the relationship that I had and still have with those lifters, that lots of them at this point have moved on from powerlifting, or their relationship with the sport has changed in significant ways, but I still know them. I still keep in touch with them. I ask about their kids, and I have pictures with them in my house, and things like that. And I think that the memory that comes back to me is of these peak experiences, standing on a big stage and doing some cool stuff that not everybody gets the opportunity to do. But the thing that makes it meaningful, like really profoundly meaningful, is the relationship that it's built on. I suppose, that's true from a business standpoint too, like how lucky am I to be in a seat where we can put a team of coaches together, and at this point, even other professionals as well. And, we can travel to a competition together, and, it's still the peak experiences that stand out in my memory, whether it's keeping you guys up all night talking about like concepts for track R a couple years ago at Nationals or an Arnold or something, but it's ultimately built off of a relationship, you know. And I mean, I suppose that's not super profound because lots of people, I think, rightfully understood that the relationship is the key element to a lot of this stuff. But I mean, it's a good time to think back and feel the gratitude for that type of thing, you know, to feel the gratitude to be in a situation to have those relationships and to have those peak experiences.
Well, then let's finish things off with a little bit of advice for maybe a young and upcoming coach. I think it can be really difficult as a coach who's working their way up the ladder and wanting to be a good coach and wanting it to be a successful coaching company and a successful business. And you talked about learning the business side earlier and knowing some of those aspects and being able to read some of your financials. And here you are talking about your proudest moments as a coach being linked to the relationship with the person, with the human. So if a young coach is trying to really cultivate their business, what's the most important thing for them to focus on? Like the cultivation of the business and growing the business and knowing how to do that, or the relationships they're building with the people they're working with?
I definitely think you can do both of those things together, and you'd have to. And in fact, one key relationship to cultivate would be a mentorship relationship. And that's something that I did not do a good enough job of. I would have been better off to have cultivated something like that earlier. It's something I understood to be beneficial. I just didn't I didn't put enough effort into finding that relationship and put enough effort into that relationship. But somebody to mentor you along. So when you were starting to formulate your question, I was anticipating and I'm thinking about different advice that I might give, right? And it's centers around like having a good perspective on like how much growth can you expect from this, because it's not infinite, and having a vision in mind for where you want to take things, because we just kind of assume that businesses are made for growth, but that's not always the case. Or, you know, putting your athletes first, that cultivation of good athlete relationships and the old standby of word of mouth advertising being the best kind of advertising. Like that's all good advice, but just like with coaching advice, the best advice is advice that's tailored for your specific situation. And again, I think that, I mean, that's mentorship, you know, that's finding somebody that's a bit more experienced than you and talking about this sort of thing. And you get there, you get to these sorts of topics and you start to, I guess if it's going to boil down to one thing, it would be to pay attention to your business and put effort into it. Find somebody who's able to guide you in the same way that you would if you're putting the same kind of effort toward your own athletic success.
Awesome, Mike. Thank you so much. And I think I can speak on behalf of the entire RTS coaching staff when I say this. And as a lifter of yours, all the lifters that you've gotten to work with over the years, I'm sure would agree with these sentiments. But I super appreciate all your effort over the last 15 years in cultivating your craft and the things that you've brought to the table for the sport of powerlifting. For me as a person, as a lifter, and as a coach, it's radically changed the quality of my life.
Same goes for me. I never imagined that this would be how things would shape up, and it's friggin' cool.
As long as I've known him, Mike has been passionate about powerlifting. I got to watch him build a powerlifting team from the ground up at the Air Force Academy and compete on the world stage. As an active duty officer in the United States Air Force, I also saw him engineer training programs for various iron sport athletes and for people who just wanted to get stronger in a smarter way. Witnessing him leverage the rate of perceived exertion concept in powerlifting was incredible. In 2008, he founded Reactive Training Systems and was impactful with so many athletes that I wasn't surprised when he decided to transition to full-time coaching. It was also fascinating to see the conception and development of RTS as one of the earliest online strength coaching platforms. Throughout the years, our family has traveled the world, and along the way, Mike amassed a number of successes, has gotten to stand on a lot of podiums, and has built a positive reputation for himself. I think he's most proud of the people he and his coaching team have guided to the podium and how they've enriched the powerlifting community worldwide. One of the many things I appreciate about the passion he and his team share with the powerlifting world is the methodical and practical approach taken to improving the lifts. I'm further impressed that they not only build an athlete's potential for specific competitions, but for the athlete's long-term goals, powerlifting career longevity, and integrating powerlifting into the harmony of daily life. I feel so lucky to have seen it all up close. Honestly, this journey has been beyond what I could have imagined, and it inspires me. Mike is an amazing human. He's an awesome partner and a phenomenal parent. I'm glad Mike and his team are still doing amazing things through Reactive training systems, and I hope they continue to make powerlifting a force to be reckoned with worldwide.